My name is Caleb Cordry. I'm a software engineer on the AMP core team. Today, I'm going to be talking about sustaining an ever-growing AMP component library. We'll get into what that means in a second. But it's basically about some of the challenges we faced with the increasing popularity of AMP. Specifically, I want to be spending a lot of time talking about vendor integrations in AMP. And so what do we mean by vendor here? I've put some logos of companies you might recognize, but basically a vendor is a service provider on the web by our definition. They can be social networks, ad networks, media players, media streaming services, many other forms. In the non-AMP world, these usually take the form of like a JS snippet that a publisher would include on their page, and then you would get the functionality from sort of these vendors. As all of you probably know, we don't allow sort of random snippets on AMP pages. So we provide alternative ways for these vendors to integrate. And this is very critical for AMP, as these services and vendors sort of make up the open web as we know it. AMP, I don't think, would be nearly as popular without support from a lot of these partners. And so today we just want to start a conversation around sort of the current status quo with these third-party integrations, as well as some of the potential problems, again, with AMP's growth and our extension growth in particular. And at the end, I'll talk about some of the ideas sort of we've been talking about internally, a little bit externally, and we want all your feedback. So cool. To start with, does anyone know the current number of extensions in AMP? It's actually 143 right now. And I actually pulled this a couple weeks ago. This is a pretty large number. I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually out of date by now. Again, like this growth curve, even the growth rate just keeps increasing for AMP. It's not slowing down at all. But this is actually good news because it's sort of a metric for AMP's popularity and influence on the web. Okay, so I have another number here. One-off extensions for single vendors, which is a little confusing. But what I mean is like these are extensions with their own name, specific functionality, and usually like developed by and for a specific company to add their feature to AMP, right? And we have 69 of these right now. And so like, why is this red? Why is it potentially a problem? Maybe I'll talk a little bit more about it later, but there's a good chance that like several of these extensions are sort of duplicating very similar things. And there's probably an opportunity to sort of like move out shared logic and make these things more generic and maybe a little more clear for users, things like that. It's an interesting number, something to sort of keep in mind for the talk. Here's just a list of all our extensions. I actually had Google Slides animate as fast as it could, and it's still, you can see like this list by itself is just sort of overwhelming.
Is this 163 individual slides?
No, it's like, you can animate like per line or whatever. Yeah. I have slides tips later. That's a different talk though. So yeah, inclusion is the key to AMP success, but there's definitely some problems that come along with the growth of this list. What kind of problems are we talking about? Things like abandoned extensions or slower builds on our friend Travis here. So there's a few problems that exist, like sort of related to these things. When most of these extensions were introduced, our code review process was mostly focused on like AMP's core UI and performance principles, not necessarily on like file structure and sort of like generality and these sort of things, at least at the beginning. And often when a contribution is made, we don't have a full picture of a vendor's business model. We can kind of learn these things through design review and like just interactions on Slack and stuff. But often, companies pivot or things change, go out of date quickly. We also don't have great test coverage on a lot of these third-party integrations. They don't have sort of robust coverage. Regressions probably will happen. A lot of us are software engineers. We know this stuff just happens. It could be changes on the app side, break something, changes on sort of the third-party side, also break stuff, right? And often we don't know who to call when things break. We don't have like a great systematic way to like say, this is the point of contact. People switch companies, things like this. Same thing, sunset extensions. Like sometimes people want to deprecate things. We do have like a policy for this now, but again, we don't know who to call, things like this. Yeah, and things Travis I hit on a little bit, but it's like When we're testing things, we have to build all these extensions. This growth grows sort of linearly with the number of extensions. Our infrastructure team does a great job, but someone earlier in a talk mentioned or asked a question about CI flakes, right? Like this problem gets worse with more extensions. So let's take a step back for a second. Do any of you know what MIP is? Yeah, of course. So for those of you who don't know, it was a fork of AMP by Baidu. It's mainly for the Chinese market. So guess how many extensions MIP has? Over 1,300, right? This is like a huge number. It was sort of their goal to have every major player on the web have a presence in their repo. They even automated sort of their extension and submission guideline processes. And some of our team members actually spoke with them. It seems like it sort of wound up being unmaintainable. Their blog's been inactive for a while. They used to post weekly. It's sort of an illustration of extreme case, but it's something to keep in mind, like sort of as AMP grows, like how can we sort of manage this number of extensions? Okay, so I'm talking a little bit about these two terms. I mentioned them a lot. Like, what do they actually mean? So AMP integration is what we're calling any way for a partner to be supported in AMP, right? Like you work for some company, you want your feature on AMP pages, it's integration. AMP extension is a specific custom element. This gets its own JavaScript binary, so, we serve it like individually, things like AMP carousel, AMP YouTube. A common misconception is these two things are the same. They are, in fact, not the same. We provide many ways for integration in AMP, not necessarily as an AMP extension. And we probably provide more ways than we need for integrations, something we'll talk about a little bit. But don't misunderstand this. We're not saying like we don't want these integrations. We don't want new vendors. We definitely do. We absolutely should welcome these people. Again, AMP wouldn't be what it is without them. Instead, we just want to help choose our partners or help our partners choose the right way to integrate in AMP. Okay, so I have this graph here. This is not to scale or anything, but just like general groupings I want to kind of illustrate. It's the different ways that AMP vendors are currently integrating with AMP, basically. If I explain a little bit, so the x-axis here is the total lines of code. So as you move right, it's just basically bigger extensions. This is per extension. So the things on the right are bigger extensions. The y-axis is how much vendor-specific code is in that extension, like how much single-purpose code for the specific feature. So as you move up on the y-axis towards the top, there's less general code, we could say. And again, the important part is sort of like the groups, right? Like there's these different clusters you can kind of see. Again, just to really hammer this home, you can imagine sort of there's a red line here, and as things approach this line, it would mean that like 100% of that extension is specific for like a single purpose, right? And why is it red? Again, we want to sort of move away from this. The idea is that we can make things more generic, more like single purpose, more like clear what their specific functionality is, but then have different ways that people use them. Right, so things on the bottom left, they're small, generic extensions. Things on the top right would be large, non-generic or single-purpose extensions. So if we talk about a few of these specific ones, on the bottom left, we have things like AMP iframe. So a lot of you all are probably familiar with AMP iframe, but there's no vendor code at all, right? Like nothing a vendor would check into our repo. A publisher on their page, when they're writing their HTML, would just add a source URL. We fetch that in an iframe, and we provide a few post-message APIs to the iframe, but basically we leave what happens inside of it up to the vendor itself. As we move up and to the right a little bit, we have things like AMP add. It's pretty similar to AMP iframe, but we also provide our AMP runtime will provide a JavaScript API to the iframe. And big difference is vendor will check in a config file, right? So AMP iframe, no code at all. AMP add, we have like a config file. Keep moving up and to the right, we have things like AMP Twitter. In addition to like sort of the stuff for AMP add, the iframe, the APIs, there's now actually code that lives in our repo, contributed by folks at Twitter. and they write JS, there's an AMP Twitter JS file, right? And then we have things like AMP Apester Media. Wanted to sort of talk about this one because it seems like very similar to things like AMP Twitter, AMP Facebook, but they have their own code. They're doing sort of their own iframe. They don't have like the same post message APIs, things like that. Maybe like this is an opportunity to like see that this thing is similar to the others, and they could share sort of a core component and have like, just different specific functionality. Oh, sorry, one thing I didn't mention, there's like a horizontal and vertical separator here. The horizontal one, the things on top of it have their own name, right? Like branded AMP Twitter, AMP Facebook. The things below it are generic names. And the vertical line, the things to the left are iframes. The things to the right have no iframes. Like if we load the external JavaScript in an iframe. Okay, so based on all this information, can you guess what like the vendor's default choice is when they decide to integrate? Well, it's these things. They have their names in it, right? It's like a natural choice. We want this branding. Our competitors have their names in it, so we want our name in it too. But this is not without its drawbacks. Vendors also think this gives them a lot of flexibility because until AMP script, it's really like the only way you can get JavaScript to run on your AMP pages, right? You like have to check it into a repo. But sometimes they don't realize all the implications. Dependencies. What I mean by this, so we've had a few talks, especially like on day 0, about sort of the process to contribute a new extension. But often there's like things like intents to implement, IDIs, that we want to have like a big discussion about with the AMP team or whoever stakeholders. And then you'll have design review, back and forth on the PR, owner's approval, things like this. This is all good, but it does take time, right? Also, you would then have a dependency on the AMP release cycle. So stuff breaks sometimes. Maybe you find a bug, you fix it immediately, but the way AMP release cadence is like it can be like 2 weeks before it gets shipped to production, right? And our bar for cherry picks is intentionally quite high. So like even if something is broken, we may determine that you don't meet the bar for a cherry pick, and then you're kind of stuck for 2 weeks. Okay, so hopefully now you understand a little bit about like the problem we're facing. I want to make it clear this is very much a work in progress. We have some like ideas, but we want your feedback on these things. So a couple of the ideas we have, call this proposal 1. It's really one idea with 2 parts, but concise portfolio of levels of integration. It's kind of a mouthful. I can't say it. But the idea here is that all these different approaches, there's like this whole spectrum on that graph, right? Like from no code to a lot of code. It's a lot of different choices. And we nowadays in like things like retail, we notice that like often giving less choices is the right decision, right? Less cognitive load. So that's the general idea here. Reduce this wide spectrum of ways to integrate with a few well-defined choices. So if we go back to this graph, we have all these different groupings. I've highlighted some of the ones on the bottom of the green we've had pretty good success with. Things like AMP Add and AMP Analytics. In fact, AMP Add and AMP Embed right now have about 200 vendors sharing these extensions. And AMP Analytics has about 70 sharing AMP Analytics. So the idea behind this proposal is that we could sort of extend this pattern to let other people share extensions. So like maybe we let video players share AMP Video iframe. And no matter what, one of the key things we want is sort of more educational resources around like what it means to integrate into AMP and what the expectations are moving forward. So if I sort of break this graph down into a few well-defined groups, the idea here is that we kind of start at level 1 as default case. And if we can't make the feature work in that, we move to level 2. We explore level 2, we can't make it work, we move to level 3. So level 1 is things like AMP iframe. We share an extension, we load all the vendor JS in an iframe. So like just a source URL, right? Level 2 is something maybe like AMP Twitter, not AMP Twitter. Like this would be like AMP video with a type, right? You share an extension, all the camp is code is amp repo, but there's a lot of like shared logic, generic code that's reused. And then level 3 would be your own extension with your own namespace, and all your code would live in the amp repo. This is things like amp Twitter now. I guess Twitter owns iframe, so it'd be things like amp skim links now, maybe. What would this API look like? Sort of hit at this, but like things like amp YouTube, amp Vimeo can become amp video iframe type YouTube. Things like amp Twitter, amp Facebook can become type Twitter, or amp embed type Twitter, amp embed type Facebook, right? And so the intent here is not to just bundle this vendor-specific code into one extension, but to sort of extract the common needs and push the vendor-specific things into like external JS that we load or config files. And there's some benefits here, like it'd be much easier for AMP community to maintain an extension whose functionality is like well discussed, documented, expectations are clear, as opposed to like some extension called like AMP company name X, and they could be a food delivery company, but they get into crypto and all of a sudden they want way different things for the same extension, right? Cool. So that's sort of the first proposal. Again, the second one is just an idea built on top of the first idea. But if we have these different levels of integration, there should be a different bar for each level. What does this mean? We'll take a step back for a second. So these are current requirements to have your own extension in an AMP. You can read it, but the gist of it is it must meet notability requirements in English Wikipedia and be used or requested by the 5% of the top 10,000 websites. So the question is, like, is this actionable right now? It can be hard to measure, right? The 5% thing, especially. And are the current extensions, or are they currently evaluated against this rule? It's unclear to me. Also, is this fair? What about like some hot new startup that wants to integrate with AMP? How do we know when they should? Do we try to like guess their growth rate? It's unclear. So yeah, the gist of proposal 2 is that with these different levels of integration, we have different bar. So the new rule of thumb maybe could be something like the more vendor code in AMP, the higher SLA required. What does SLA mean? We sort of need to work out these details, but things around automated tests, dedicated support channels, things like that. We've had some conversations with the TSC about this sort of thing, but again, we really want your input. You are a lot of our users. We specifically want your input on things like, do you agree? Is making this things generic is making things more generic better? Do different requirements make sense, right? Do you all feel strongly that you should have your own extension? Like maybe you don't like this idea at all. Like things like, what should this SLA look like? How should we enforce testing requirements? Should we require the support channel? Like how do we enforce that, right? All these things are still up for debate. And if you care, now's the time. We're like currently working through this. So get your feedback in and we'll definitely integrate it into our process. Cool. So I made this slide here, or an issue on GitHub, sort of a catch-all issue for discussion right now, if you want. Also on Slack, ads and analytics teams, we deal with a lot of the third-party integrations. If you have more general ideas, reach out to the Outreach Working Group. And if you want to message me specifically, I'm Caleb on Slack. And that's all.